I'm Martin Carnoy from Stanford University, and I'd like to welcome you to the session on PISA. Hank Levin unfortunately can't be here today, so those of you who came to see him, I'm sorry that you're going to be disappointed. It's of no fault of his own. Our featured speaker is Andreas Schleicher from the OECD, who runs the PISA program there. And so we're going to start now. So since the place is almost full, this will give us more time at the end for questions. I must leave at 11:45, so I will then turn it over to Bill Schmidt, sitting on my right from Michigan State University, to chair the rest of the session and take the questions. So, Andreas?
Thanks very much, Martin. So why care about international comparisons? Well, the first question we can ask ourselves is why care about education? Or why care about skills? And we did recently an interesting study. We surveyed not students in school, but we actually tested the workforce in different countries. The test that was quite similar than the PISA test, though a lot easier, I must say. And this is just an example that shows you how predictive or how strongly related the skills of people in the adult population are to, for example, being employment. You're at the high end of the skill distribution, you're more than twice as likely to be employed than at the low end. You are more than 3 times as likely to get a decent wage. We find a relationship with health, with your propensity to volunteer. We can even see that people at the high end of the skill distribution see themselves more likely to be actors in society. At the low end, they feel that they are objects in political processes. And even things like trust. I mean, whatever the nature of the causal relationship, even trust in societies is actually quite well predicted by the skills of people. That's the average picture about OECD countries, and then that varies a lot. You take a country like the United States, those relationships are a lot stronger. No? The US labor market is very, very good at extracting value from skills, no? Converting skills into jobs and better lives of people. So those relationships vary. No? I think it's a powerful illustration why we should care, if not about international comparisons, at least about the results of educational processes. So that brings me to PISA. This is just sort of a map of the countries that we can compare currently. It's pretty much the industrialized world. We tested about 500,000 students every 3 years. And they take a test that tries to look beyond whether students can extrapolate, can just sort of reproduce what they were taught, to assess whether they can actually make sense of what they know and use and apply their knowledge in novel situations. And the reason why we use that kind of philosophy or approach is simply because the world economy no longer pays you for what you know. Now, Google knows everything. The world economy really pays you for what you can do with what you know. Sort of using your knowledge in a novel situation is the idea. And then we basically also collect a lot of contextual data that helps us understand the context in which students learn, teachers work, and schools operate. The principles, you ask yourself always, how do you actually create a sensible international test that is valid across different cultures, different countries? And actually the answer is that's not easy. We spend a lot of time actually working with experts in the field. The development of a single PISA test takes about 5 years. So that's sort of the trajectory, building a framework. How do you define mathematics or whatever you assess in a way that works across countries, putting sort of a lot of emphasis on validity across cultures, languages, systems. That involves a lot of piloting. You typically develop about 4 to 6 items for anyone that we use. Triangulation, nobody knows what's actually happening in a classroom, at least not through kind of survey instruments. So we actually look at the phenomena through many different angles. And then we try to use the most advanced research methods to study the data. That's sort of in a nutshell how this whole thing works. Very complex process, quite expensive process, but one that I think we've learned that we need to actually build in those mechanisms to obtain relevant and valid and reliable comparisons. So a couple of results. Now, what can 15-year-olds do? The first thing, that's sort of the kind of media like to do that. Now you can line up countries where they come out of the test. Now these are 15-year-olds in every country. We basically focus on an age group because it's the only sensible comparison across countries. Now, if you take a grade, you know, people might have started schooling at different ages. There might be retention in the system and so on, grade repetition. So we basically just say, well, you know, everybody becomes 15-year-olds sometime in their life. We use it as a comparison. And when you do that, actually, you see a lot of variability in the outcomes of 15-year-olds across countries now. 40 points on that scale is the equivalent of about a school year. So you see about 6 school years on that slide, ranging from the top, many Asian countries, but also some European doing really well, up to the bottom. And I'm not going to show you the countries with very low performance because the screen is not large enough. If you take a country like the United States, of course, there's also a lot of variability in this. And you can see, for example, a state like Massachusetts does really quite well. Now comes into the green area. Connecticut is sort of so-so, and Florida comes out with really low results. And so there is, in most countries, variability between regions, between schools, and obviously between students. That's very important. I want to put a second dimension into this, and this is equity. We put a lot of emphasis in the comparisons. In some countries, the impact of social background on learning outcomes is very strong. Success in school depends very closely on the social context of students, and others' learning outcomes are more equitably distributed. This is where everybody wants to be, where performance is very good and social background is not making much of a difference. This is where nobody likes to be, where performance is poor and social background is a very strong predictor for learning outcomes. And then you can debate, is it better to be here where performance is good but there are large disparities, or you focus on that quadrant where performance is poor and results are equitable. I mean, for example, it's interesting, you know, you look at Florida and Massachusetts in the United States, and if you see these kind of two data points, you would argue, well, you have to make some choice. You have to either be like Massachusetts, where the average is good, but there are large disparities, social disparities, or you become like Florida, where everybody does sort of at a sort of lower level of performance. But in fact, when you put the rest of the countries in there, you actually see, and actually Connecticut as well, that there is not an obvious choice between quality and equity and outcome. That's a quite instructive insight, actually. There are a lot of countries in many regions in the world that are able to combine high levels of outcomes with a quite equitable distribution of performance. Last dimension I want to put into this is money, always important. The size of the dot tells you spending per student. The larger the bubble, the more is being spent per student. And if the quantity of resources would tell you everything about outcomes, you'd see all the large bubbles at the top and all the small bubbles at the bottom. That's actually not what you see. Actually, spending per student explains just about 15% of the performance variation across countries. The United States is a good example. It's the third biggest bubble after Luxembourg. That's the dark red one, and not one of the strongest performing countries. And a bit of the story you see when you actually look at how countries spend their money. The red dot tells you spending relative to spending capacity that actually arrives in the classroom. In the United States, that's only about half of the money that is spent per student that actually arrives in the classroom. And then you also see that countries spend their money very differently. You can see basically salaries is one cost driver, and you look at the Koreans, I've highlighted them here. Now they pay their teachers really, really well. That drives costs upwards. And Koreans also want to have their students sitting in for long hours in school. Now that's the white bar, driving costs up further. And then the Koreans do one thing more. They say we not only want our teachers to teach, we also want our teachers to sort of have a lot of room for working with parents, discipline, peer learning. There's a lot of money being spent on non-teaching working hours, and that drives costs up further. No? And so you ask yourself, so how do the Koreans actually pay for that? And the answer is they have very large classes. That's driving costs downward. And you go to the next country on the list, that's Luxembourg there. They spend exactly as much as the Koreans do, but they spend their money very differently. In Luxembourg, everybody likes small classes, parents, teachers, and so on. That's driving costs upwards, the blue bar. But even Luxembourg can spend its money only once. So you can see actually there's a price for this. That's basically instruction hours. The school days are short. The white bar goes down. So you have teachers not paid so well relative to what the spending capacity is. And teachers have very little time for doing anything else than teaching. That's the yellow bar. So the point I'm making actually is that it's not only the international comparisons not only show you how much you spend, which is not a good predictor on outcomes, they tell you a lot that money goes into very different purposes. And you can see the same thing at the end of the spectrum. Finland and the United States are both sort of countries that spend relatively little per student in the classroom. But if you look at this closely, despite being in a very different culture, Finland looks very similar to Korea in the way it spends its money. And the United States looks a lot more similar to Luxembourg. And when you do actually, this is a very crude picture. You can do those kind of spending analysis in much more sophisticated ways, and you do actually see that there are certain patterns that emerge. High-performing education systems, the ones coming out on top, typically prioritize variables relating to teachers and teaching over things like classes. And that's really important, so we can actually predict. Well, the one thing I can say was the kind of contextual information that we collect in PISA, we can now predict about 85% of the performance variation of schools around the world. Not the simple volume measures, but once you drill down, you can get a lot further. Last point I want to make is, this picture hasn't been static. If you look, actually, there's some changes. You take the United States. It's not stood still. The media have always said there has been no change in the United States performance picture. No, actually, the bubble moved rightward. What does it mean? The performance distribution in the United States has become somewhat more equitable. But because the bubble didn't move upward, it actually means that performance gains for the disadvantaged children have been paid for with performance losses among the middle-class children. Some countries do better than that. At the top end, you had Shanghai now moving into the next grade. They actually continue to raise their outcomes, or Singapore, moving upwards. At the bottom end, very interesting. So some of the top performing systems continue to improve. At the bottom end, look at Turkey, moving upwards and rightwards. Very impressive performance gain, and also very impressive in closing social gaps. Germany, moving rightwards, closing social gaps, moving upwards. The big impact of PISA, and that sort of tells us something about why we should care about comparisons in Germany, was surprise, deep surprise about the large social disparities. Now, everybody thought, teachers are paid the same, classes are of the same size, we have an equitable education system. Suddenly they look at those kind of data, and they did something about it, and they've actually been able to reduce those social gaps by a large margin. You look at Italy, moving upwards, moving rightwards. Poland, very impressive performance gains, not on the social side, but in terms of average performance. Or Portugal, moving a bit to the left, opening up some disparities, but actually raising overall performance. So all I'm showing here that we are not living in a static world. International comparisons tell us that the world is changing. Why should we care about it? Because in a global economy, it's no longer, the benchmark is no longer whether you come better relative to how you were yesterday. Everybody is improving somewhat, but you measure success by what we see in the most advanced education system. A lot of real change in education. In fact, the most encouraging insight for me is that we have, among the 65 countries for which we have comparative data, 40 have actually seen real improvement, measurable. I show you sort of 3 examples of this. This is Germany, the performance gap between the quarter of the most disadvantaged kids and the advantaged in 2003. In 2012, it looked like this. So actually, the big improvement at the low end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and that has actually led performance to rise. You look at the United States, 2003, 2012, the gap has been shrinking, but at both ends. And then you look at Poland, Poland has raised the entire performance spectrum, so socioeconomic gaps have not been closing, but in fact it's the most successful performance gain among all the three countries. Now, this is the kind of thing that we are able now to track over time. I want to sort of say something about resilience. You know, a lot of people say, well, outcomes are all a phenomenon of social context. No? If you come from a poor background, you're going to do a lot less well. But international comparisons are a very powerful way to actually look behind them. And they show us that the country where you go to class matters a lot more than what social class you come from. I'll show you some data on that. Here I'm basically looking at the performance of kids by decile of social background. No? The red dot are the poor kids in Mexico, and the green ones are the ones from wealthy families. And what you see is that the people from poor families do worse than the people from wealthy families. Now, we all know that. And there's nothing wrong with the Mexicans. Now, you can see the same thing in virtually every country. No? But once you start to do that across countries, you see something really interesting. No? The red kids have the same social background across all countries. No? The green ones too. So you can see that in similar social contexts, very different performance levels are reached. And that tells us something. You know, some people say, you know, oh, well, you know, how do we know that all of the kids are equally well represented in the sample? You can actually see you can achieve very differently from similar backgrounds. Now, actually, you look at this. Actually, basically, you take the kids in Shanghai. No? Some people have argued, well, are we sure that we have captured adequately all of the illegal immigrants in Shanghai? And there are sort of minor questions. I don't think they're going to have an impact, measurable impact on the overall results. But even if you assume they do, they don't change this picture that even the poorest kids in Shanghai, from very poor family, outperform their peers from wealthy families elsewhere. What you see here is that the extent to which education systems leverage talent from disadvantage varies enormously across countries. I believe that we should care about it because it tells us actually how well we could be doing, in raising the performance of the poorest kids across countries. Huge differences in the results of children from very similar social backgrounds across countries. You can look at this in another way. This is the United States, you know, on the horizontal axis, social background, on the vertical axis, student performance. No? Every dot is one school. The larger dots are the larger schools, the smaller dots are the smaller schools, and so on. And what you can see is what you saw before. Now, the children from more advantaged backgrounds in schools perform better. There is a relationship. But you also see there are a lot of variations. Now, these are children in schools with similar performance, and you can see they come from different social backgrounds. And these are kids from similar social backgrounds, and you can see school performance varies enormously. Similar schools achieving very different results. And then you compare that across countries. You keep in mind this picture, the United States, and then compare that with Vietnam. The kids are a lot poorer than the kids in the United States. But the schools still do better. And this tells us something, that poverty isn't destiny, that we can really do a lot about this. Of course, a lot of this is context. Go back to the United States, you know. The cloud moves rightwards. Now, kids have a much wealthier families, much better educated families, and all these kind of things. But performance doesn't rise. Huge differences in the outcomes of education systems. It's also not just about poor kids in poor neighborhoods. Actually, we can see that there are performance challenges of many kids in many neighborhoods. In fact, the between-school variability in a country like the United States isn't what dominates the picture. You know, there are some people going around saying, well, you just have to look at whatever, a few dropout factories, very poor performing schooling, you fix the education system. No, actually, most of the performance variation in the United States is actually in schools. There are a lot of challenges in many classrooms, in many schools, in many regions, in many states. And that's actually true in the majority of countries. Between schools, and we can actually unpack that. We can look at the extent to which performance variation does lie within or between schools, classroom, regions, and countries. Very, very important for us to learn how those things vary. There's also sort of the question of top-performing students. Now, who actually makes it to the top? And you can see that there's huge variation across this. Again, you go to Shanghai, and you can see that every second child is able to work with complex models for mathematical situations, demonstrate advanced mathematical thinking. Those kids have not only learned the routines and procedures and the theorems, they actually can think mathematically. Very, very impressive. And on average, you just talk about a bit more than 1.10. And again, this is something where in the United States there's enormous variability. No? Massachusetts and Connecticut having a decent share of top performers, Florida a lot less so. No? Why should we worry about this? Go back to our adult skills survey, and you can actually see that high performance matters a lot in terms of employment. If you have just medium to low problem-solving skills as measured by our adult skills survey, you actually see a steep decline in employment in the OECD area. And it's not difficult to understand. Those jobs are easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. If you have very low skills, people pay you less, but you keep your job. Now, there are many jobs in our economies that do not require great skills, so that's not the problem area. But the only area where we've actually seen employment growth is for people with advanced skills. So those things actually matter. And we work in a basically global market on the advanced skill side. So actually how you do in PISA, to the extent that it's predictive for adult skills, is actually really, really important. People call this the hollowing out of labor markets. The phenomena are theoretically quite well understood, but we now have actually good data to demonstrate that. I want to come back, and I think Bill is going to go into much greater depth on this, but international comparisons also tell us, that a mathematics score doesn't mean the same thing in different contexts. I show you an example. This is the exposure of children to word problems in mathematics. One way you can teach mathematics is to give children simple mathematical situations in sort of a complicated word context. And I must say I hated those kind of things most. All you need to do is extract the number, solve the problem, and you've done the job. It's not very sophisticated. Look at Iceland. That's the most prevalent way of teaching in Iceland, according to what the students tell us. Now we have to trust them on this. What is interesting now, that's the way they teach in Iceland, but that's not the way they teach in East Asia. Now all the East Asian countries are on the left side. Now they don't do many of those kinds of word problems. PISA tells us those kind of things. Does it matter? Well, surprise, surprise, Iceland is not doing particularly well. Those East Asians do really well. There's another way you can look at this. You can teach mathematics by focusing on conceptual understanding, a little bit more on the formal side of mathematics. And what you see here is they don't do those things in Iceland. But they do those kind of things very much so in the top-performing East Asian countries. Or you can look at application. There, Iceland is sort of more in the middle. And what PISA also allows us to do is we can then see, does it actually matter? What's the right balance? It's obviously a question. It's very, very hard to distill from this what is the appropriate balance in math teaching. But you can actually study that empirically. If you expose your students never to applied mathematics, they seem to be doing not so well. If they do that always, they don't seem to do that always well, but it seems to question of right balance. So international comparisons tell us not only how well you do, but they give you a lot of insight, in fact, on how students are exposed to different forms of mathematics teaching. Students are really good observants. If they were not, this would be a random variable. We wouldn't see any of those kinds of relationships. Of course, behind that there can be many, many factors. Students in vocational programs tend to focus more on application. That might drag their kind of performance down a bit. But the nature of the causal relationship is always another complex story. But at least we can observe those kinds of differences. Doing well in one subject doesn't mean that you do well in another. I want to compare mathematics and problem-solving performance here. Well, you know, what you would expect if everything would be just a measure of, you know, general abilities, that students who do well in mathematics also do well on problem solving. Now you put a straight line into this. It's true in some countries, but not in everyone. Look at the United States. In fact, in the United States and also England do better on problem solving skills than they do on mathematics. Particularly for those kids that are really good in mathematics, they do even better in problem solving. And the difference between math and problem solving here is that the problems in the problem solving assessment didn't require mathematical content knowledge. You have countries like Japan, actually, where they also do better on creative problem solving skills, but more on the bottom end of the skill distribution. That's the driver for the difference. Here's a country where it goes the other way around, Spain. Anybody who has been in a Spanish school knows that sort of rote learning is heavily dominant. Students have to memorize lots of material, very little exposure to problem solving, and you see that in the data. Particularly the kids with low mathematics performance are even poorer in problem solving skills. Poland also is doing okay in mathematics, but not so well on problem solving across the board. No? And then you can see Singapore that is doing exactly as predicted. No? So there are very important variations that tell us a lot about the underlying education systems. No? How mathematics is taught, how mathematics performance varies when you look at other subject areas and so on. And so therefore we learn a lot about ourselves through international comparisons by seeing ourselves in the mirror of what other countries demonstrate is possible. Let me come to the toughest part. Yeah. You know, what have we learned about this? And this is where sort of the quantitative comparisons end, and where you have to sort of look into many of the contextual factors. And I want to order things by their relative impact on outcomes and by the political and financial cost of reforms. Everybody wants to focus on things that are very easy to do and very important. Nobody wants to invest in things that are hard to do and very expensive, not very important. Countries all want to move the agenda forward, doing some things that are really, really hard to do but very, very important. And then you can pick up some low-hanging fruits, things that are maybe not so important but easy to do. Let me just sort of highlight some of the factors that we have consistently found identified with better performance on PISA. Again, you know, I can't say anything about the causal nature of that relationship, but I want to lead you through some of those factors. The first thing that we see is that high-performing countries really put a great value on education. And there is the belief in the system that all children can achieve. You know, it's so interesting. You can see that even in the mindset of 15-year-olds as it comes out through our context questionnaires. When we ask 15-year-olds, you know, what do you believe makes you successful in mathematics? You have many students in North America, but also some European countries who tell you, oh, it's clear, it's all a question of talent. No? If I'm not born as a genius in mathematics, I better study something else. If you ask the same question to the Chinese or the Japanese, they tell you consistently, you know, if I really try hard, I trust my teachers are going to help me and I'm going to be successful. It tells you a lot about education system. In one case, education is really just sorting you. There's nothing you can do yourself. In the other case, the education system gives you the sense that you own your own learning. And that's actually what we very much see in those countries. There's a couple of measures that we have on this. We have a measure of self-efficacy in mathematics on the horizontal axis, and this is not self-concept. No? Self-concept, you know, do I believe I'm great in mathematics? That is not very predictive. But when you look at, do I believe that I can overcome a challenging problem I haven't seen in mathematics, a very specific situation, and on the vertical axis is performance. And you can see that there is a very strong relationship within countries, but even across countries. And you know, some people say this is all about culture. No? The Asians have some special gene that makes them motivated, and so in mathematics. But you know, you see Shanghai very much on the right side, and Japan and Korea very much on the left side. No? There is no kind of simple cultural factor in those kind of variables. Highly predictive within every country. There's another way of how to look at this, and this is basically, who do you blame when things go wrong? Let's have a look at the average Shanghai, and France. You look at this data and you can see the French kids blame everybody except themselves, no, for 6. I'm unlucky, the teacher didn't get me interested in, the course material was too hard, and so on. No? And you look at this, varies across countries. No? Of course, again, you can say, well, that is culture. But then you ask yourself, to what extent is culture inherited by the context or actually created by what we do? Very, very important findings. And you can see actually those things do matter. When you look at the gender gap among the highest among students now, you can see once we control for self-efficacy, the gender gap turns in most countries the other way around. So actually those variables actually have a strong impact on many of the actual behavior and the outcomes. Things education systems should worry about, and some seem to be doing a lot better than others on this. Gateways and instructional system, I'm not going to say much of it, we're running out of time, but we do see actually that high-performing systems are very good not only in having clearly articulated goals of what good performance is, but they also align them well with the curriculum and instructional system so that actually what arrives in the classroom is pretty consistent. And again, we can measure that through the data we get from students. Let's get to the left side, capacity at the point of delivery. No? High-performing systems consistently tend to be good at attracting great people, developing, retaining good teachers, are strong on instructional leadership. As far as we can measure this, I must say that's where our measurement is not yet very much strong, and they are able to keep teaching an attractive profession. And again, those things are, you see them in Finland in Northern Europe as much as you see them in Japan or Shanghai. I'm skipping the data on that, but I basically, incentive structures and accountability, I put it pretty low. The impact on outcomes is hard to sort of detect, but it's a thing that certainly can be relatively easily done. Just a couple of data points. No? You see some surprises in this data. If you think about it, you would always characterize the United States as the country of local control. No? Well, that's the way that education systems look when you look at it from the bird's eye. When you actually look at it through the eyes of schools, you see actually something very different. Because most of the control lies at the level of the district. When you actually study the relative discretion that individual schools have, the United States performs quite low. You can see a country like Japan giving its schools a lot more room for maneuver than schools in the United States have. Very important insights you gain from this. And then you can actually study how do they matter in terms of outcomes. These are just some very crude pictures, but basically what we can see, if you have no shared vision of what mathematics is, now we call it a standardized mathematics policy, but it's essentially like, the existence of a common core or something like this. If you have no shared vision, more school autonomy, the schools with more autonomy seem to be doing actually worse than the schools with less autonomy. If you do have a clearly shared vision of what good mathematics is, you can see actually school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. You actually can see some of those variables in conjunction work really well. Here's another facet. If school autonomy means, the principal decides on everything, but teachers do not participate in management, you can see that school autonomy seems to be working against you. If you have a system of distributed leadership where, teachers are part of the management equation, you can see actually school autonomy works the other way around. So it's again an example of how two variables work in a combination. And there are lots of things more. I'm going to skip that. We look at quality assurance mechanisms. Now you look at a country like Singapore that is very, very good in using multiple measures of quality assurance, whether it's internal evaluation, external evaluation, teacher mentoring, and so on. Some countries are very, very good at that, in others, much less. Last point I really want to make is that high-performing countries are typically very good to invest resources where they yield most. And that's something you can see really in interesting ways in the data. They align the resources with the challenges. They attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, and they make very effective spending choices. Very, very interesting. Have a look at just a couple of last data points. On the horizontal axis, I show you not how much countries spend on education, but how equitably they invest their resources. If you're in the green area, you basically get more resources to where the socioeconomic challenges are greater. Just a few countries do that. If you're in the red area, you actually put your sort of better teachers in the more privileged schools. Better teachers as measured by things like teacher qualifications and so on. And you can see that's true for the majority of the countries. And what you see is really interesting on this, that more equitable investment is not only yielding more equitable outcomes, of course that's what you expect. No? That would be sort of the normal outcome, but you can actually also see that more equitable investment seems to yield more efficient outcomes. No? Spending equitably seems to be sort of associated with higher overall performance. Then one last picture on that is basically you can look at teacher shortage. No? You can see that disadvantaged schools in most countries actually have much greater challenges in attracting qualified teachers than privileged schools. And again, you can see that those things do actually matter in terms of the learning outcomes. And we've actually looked quite a bit behind that. Last point I want to really make on this is, sometimes we have to look at resource factors even before school starts. One of the questions we asked recently is, we asked the 15-year-olds that were assessed to what extent they had participated in pre-primary education, things that start even before primary school. And you can see at age 15, there's quite a big performance gap between those who had a serious experience in pre-primary education. We don't know anything about the quality, I must say. We've just looked at incidence and intensity. And you can see, you talk about 60 points, 40 points, remember, one school year, there's a big difference left. And even after controlling for socioeconomic background, you do see that that gap is quite significant. The only thing that doesn't work, according to our data, the idea is, of course, the most disadvantaged children will benefit most from pre-primary education. Our data actually show the opposite. No? Children from sort of the more privileged families seem to be benefiting more. That suggests that, families that are well off may be better in figuring out what the more quality providers are. But overall, resources actually matter in different ways across countries. And the last issue is, of course, what you can see in high-performing systems is that they do things consistently across the system. They pursue policies over long periods of time. Now, we can measure this only since 10 years, but that's sort of a good period to sort of look at coherence. They are good at implementation. Now, intended policies translate actually into implemented policies as far as we can measure and achieve policies. And they actually do what they say. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So I'll introduce myself. I'm an economist, and I taught in the School of Education at Stanford for a very, very long time. I won't tell you how long. So I think that we can all agree from Andreas' slides that probably schools have something to do, and schooling quality has something to do with how well kids do on tests, and probably these tests included, have something to do with how much knowledge kids have in what schools are trying to teach them. I'm going to raise 4 points about why the PISA and TIMSS test scores differences between countries may overestimate differences in schooling quality, and why the scores may not matter much anyway for anything. So I'm going to raise 4 points, and several of these are, to be fair, discussed in Volume 4 of the PISA report. But interestingly enough, they really rarely find their way into discussions about the PISA tests, and you can say the same thing about the TIMSS tests. And they rarely find their way into an adjustment of sort of the official adjustments of the country rankings. and they're never raised in popular discussions, policy discussions of the implications for quality of schooling differences. And then, in addition to that, a major issue is what Andreas raised at the beginning of his talk, is why we in developed countries are being urged to get so excited about these test score differences, and I have a few things to say about that as well. So, do test score differences between countries represent quality of schooling differences? This is sort of the last part of Andreas' presentation. And this is a much more complex question than first appears. Controlling for individual differences in socioeconomic background of students, which, by the way, everybody acknowledges this, is highly correlated with test performance and acquired academic knowledge, and obviously this varies from country to country, but it's generally highly true. And this may only pick up part of the effect of what I would rather call in socioeconomic class family academic resources. Higher FAR students tend to go to school with other high FAR students. This is called peer effect. Should peer effect be attributed to school and teacher effectiveness? Probably not. There's actually a discussion of this in Volume 4, and it says that if you control for peer effect, for the fact that kids go to school, are much more likely to go to school with like kids, then, by the way, this varies from country to country too, but that would probably if you corrected for that, it would underestimate school effect. Well, that's a big issue, whether it really underestimates school effect, because as I'll get to later, what you really should be asking is, if you take kid X and put him in school Y, is he going to do better or is she going to do better in this other school because of the nature of the school? And if it really means just grouping your kids differently and making sure that kids now go to school not necessarily with like kids but with other kids, and you could argue then that you lose a little bit at the top but you gain a lot at the bottom. Is that really due to schooling? No. It has to do with policy of how you distribute kids across school. It has nothing to do with the school resources in each school. So if the argument is that it's the effect of the school, that's a pretty strange argument. Higher FAR students also tend to go to schools with more experienced and subject knowledgeable teachers. As Andreas showed, that again varies from country to country, and are exposed to more subject matter, what we call opportunity to learn, and Bill is going to talk a lot more about that, and Andreas raised it as well. Therefore, cross-section analysis overestimates the actual effect of schooling and of school resources, or any of these sort of things, coherence and all these other things that are put at the end of Andreas's talk. And finally, some societies place much more emphasis on and obedience to student formal learning as defined by the school system. Families and students in those societies invest more time, energy, and resources in adhering to formal learning. Unless we correct for these issues, no schools get credit or blame for these different social commitments to school learning. I mean, every teacher in America knows that if you get a kid in school or a group of kids in school that are just really committed to doing everything the teacher says, it's much more likely that the kid is going to learn the school curriculum and do well on a test than if you have kids who just don't do their work. And so, I mean, there's a lot of finger pointing, what Hank Levin calls the arthritic elbow, where the teachers blame the parents and the parents blame the teachers, and it never turns back. That person himself or herself. But the fact is that social commitment, and Andreas mentioned this, to be fair, social commitment of the society to school-based learning. I say school-based learning because it's the school system that's defining this, or perhaps even now international tests defining what should be learned in school. then if the parents are committed to that, so these Asian societies and even Asian American kids in our society are much more committed perhaps to doing well in school, and they get tremendous pressure to do that, well, they're just going to do better, no matter what school they're in. And so it may have very little to do with the school. So we have to separate all of this out in order to really figure out what part comes to this, how much you can get out of doing something in schools themselves. So higher scoring countries might definitely have better teachers in schools. They might have better teachers in schools. But they could also have families and social norms that put much greater stock in the value of schooling, and particularly on pushing students to learn what schools want students to learn. To show how this works, let's ask a hypothetical question. If you put a sample of fluent English-speaking Shanghai or Tokyo math teachers into Indianapolis schools, how much better would the average Indianapolis student perform? That's the hypothetical that you should ask. Okay? Now, Bill Schmidt's going to argue that if the teachers brought their curriculum, the gain would be large. He might be right. I'm not so sure, but he might be right. And he's going to try to convince you that he is right. He has a case to make. Now let's ask a second hypothetical question. If you transferred a sample of Indianapolis students into average Shanghai or Tokyo schools, assuming no language barrier, how much better would those students do? I would bet that the gain would be much larger in the second case. The American families and students would probably be impacted by the social contest of hyper-academic competition. However, those students from Indiana might be turned off by that regimentation of Shanghai and Tokyo schools, and they may actually be turned off and learn less than they learn in Indianapolis schools. All of this is possible. It's a very complex relationship. So let me tell you quickly about a Russian study of PISA test performance controlling for student TIMSS performance. Let's temporarily accept that the PISA test measures something about school quality, not social commitment to school knowledge acquisition, and we want to try to isolate the effects of classroom quality on student outcomes. So the Higher School of Economics in Moscow looked at the issue of teacher and OTL value added to Russian students' math test performance by applying the PISA in 2012 to the entire sample of 8th grade students who took the TIMSS in 2011. This is aside from their PISA sample. It's a completely different sample. So they gave the PISA test to everybody who took the TIMSS test a year before. Okay? So 8th graders took the TIMSS test, now they're in 9th grade, take the PISA test. And the HSE team also surveyed these students' 9th grade teachers, most were their 8th grade teachers as well, their math teachers, with a detailed questionnaire. When we controlled for students' TIMSS scores, there was some positive relation between PISA scores and A, pre-service math training in normal schools rather than in universities, so getting their math training in a pedagogical institution rather than a non-pedagogical university. And a second thing that had a positive effect was greater exposure to formal mathematics, which is one of the measures that was used in the PISA test. So we had data actually on the teachers. We had a lot of data on the teachers, not just these two things, a lot of data. And these were the only two things that really showed up once you control for their previous year's test scores. So this is kind of a value added of that year in the 9th grade. And I can't really go to the Russian Minister of Education and tell him, gee, I'm really confident that if you did something in the schools directly, you would really make the gains larger on the PISA test. Okay? I can tell him that the girls are scoring a lot lower than the boys once you control in the value added on the PISA test. I can tell them that. So if we give everybody a sex change operation, we might have a chance here to get about 1/10 of a standard deviation higher. Or we can do something about girls' feelings about mathematics, or perhaps about the items on the PISA test. Even if even these two findings faded in a more strict version of the value-added model. And in models where we divide into higher and lower SES groups, or FAR groups, the main effect of a higher quality teachers and more exposure to formal math is on the higher FAR students or SES students, not on the lower FAR students. So from our study, it's very hard to tell how you improve the scores with just using stuff in schools to improve the performance on the PISA test in that year, get the gains larger from doing something about the school variables. Now, the comparison among the U.S. states. Three states took the PISA test, but all the states take the NAEP. And by the way, there's some difference, but if you look at the TIMSS test, they're also highly correlated. So if you look, I think it's a better idea to, particularly in a decentralized system, to look at differences across states, because after all, you're kind of in the same society. So we're doing this for the U.S. between 1992 and 2011, and our preliminary findings suggest that controlling for individual student SES differences in the average SES in schools, there's a bunch of variables, including racial differences, et cetera, students in some states indeed do perform much higher in math than students in others. And also students in some states have made much larger average gains in math than in others. This in a period, by the way, when math scores in the United States were increasing in almost every state. Have these changes occurred because teaching has improved in some states but not others? Because the math curriculum changed in some states but not others? Because there is a more emphasis on testing and accountability in some states? Because reformers in particular states were able to change the social context of educational expectations rather than any particular school improvement? I don't have the answers to those questions. And you know something? Nobody does. It has not been studied. It has not been studied, even though the test data have been available for years. So let's be careful about assigning credit or blame for student performance to school quality. Even when students in various states in the same country improve their test scores more than students in other states, the magnitude of the net improvements between the highest gainers and the ones who aren't gaining as fast in a period of 10 or 15 years is about a third of a standard deviation, which is about the same as between the higher scoring countries in Europe or Canada and the US in math in 2009, and about the same as Finland's math score drop in 2009, 2012, about a third of a standard deviation. I'm just making these cases to tell you a third of a standard deviation is not as much as you might think. Finland was somehow able to drop a third of a standard deviation in 3 years in math, and nobody knows why. When we adjust for FAR differences, these are the kinds of changes we're looking at. Is a third of a standard deviation higher on this particular test at 15 years old, the difference between being competitive in the world economy or not? Well, that's the big question. Here's the most interesting part. We're told repeatedly that higher test scores mean more human capital, and more human capital, of course, is crucial for higher growth rates. It's a very persuasive argument. I agree. Societies that know more math are better problem solvers and are better at analyzing tests. Must be more productive. And they may be more productive, but there are many other factors that also contribute to higher productivity. Does improving 1/3 of a standard deviation on a given problem-solving test mean more for productivity than, for example, better macroeconomic policies, or more generally more efficient government, or a more innovative society? Ask the Japanese or the Swiss. They do a lot better than we do, and they're not growing at all over a large number of years. Thank you.
We have known for some time, given the TIMSS results, that schooling does matter. There's fairly convincing evidence to suggest there's a strong relationship between what countries cover in their standards or their curriculum and the corresponding performance of those countries. That is a school-based study, classroom-based, and so we've been able to connect those things both across countries, within countries, across schools, and across students within classrooms and schools. So we have a pretty good idea that that's the case for the test that TIMSS tends to give. Now, the TIMSS test is more a study of school-related mathematics, the kind of things that kids take in school, and it's a direct reflection of what it is. The test is a direct reflection of pretty much what that schooling looks like across the world. One of the questions that has been prevalent is in the PISA test, which focuses not on the actual formal aspects of the mathematics being learned, but on the ability to apply that mathematics in real-world contexts. Real-world contexts that include both mathematics used in a different way, but also then application to problems such as finding out how many tiles you need to lay in a room of a certain size. So the question that has existed is, well, does schooling matter much with respect to the issue of a literacy test as opposed to a more school-based test? The recent PISA that was released, that Andreas gave you the overview of the results from, actually had the capacity to look at that. And that's actually what I want to talk about. That actually, when you look at this, you come to much the same set of conclusions, that schooling does in fact influence and is related to the performance on both the literacy tests and the more formal school-based tests such as TIMSS. I want to remind you what the literacy test looks like. This is very important. This is the conceptual frame that by which the test blueprint was generated. It deals with the fact that you take and you have a problem in some kind of a context. You then have to formulate that problem, put it into mathematical terms, which then you solve mathematically, getting mathematical results. But then finally you have to take those results and interpret them. That is to turn them back to the original problem that you started with. And that's the basic framework that guided the development of the items. And as you'll see later, there are some interesting results with respect to that particular conception. What we did in the PISA test is to actually, questionnaire, is to ask questions related to the kind of experiences they had with respect to schools. And one of the kinds of questions asked them to indicate their degree of exposure to various kinds of mathematics topics. Now, for 15-year-olds around the world, this is mostly about geometry and algebra. So we asked questions and formed indices from those items. Another sort of item that was included was to give them a sample of previous PISA items and put into a category, and they were then asked to respond as to how much they had seen these kinds of items in their instruction, and then a separate question, how much they had received exposure to these types of problems in their daily, on their tests that they took. And so those are the items that sort of were used to formulate three indices. The three indices, and Andreas has already referred to them, was an index that referred to how much exposure they had to word problems. I share Andreas's feeling. I hated those problems because they would always look like you were being set up to get an answer that everybody knew and you didn't care about. But basically, that's a very standard textbook type of problem. And they do try, in some sense, to deal with applications. The other two indices, one was formal mathematics, which was the standard kind of thing like solving an algebraic equation. The third type was actually looking at the application of those things to a real-world problem, something that they were being asked that would involve finding how much a discount, a 10% discount, would actually amount to, being able to take information from various kinds of graphic presentations and draw conclusions. So those were the three indices that we used. This box and whisker plot simply shows that there is a substantial amount of variation across the countries that participated as to the amount of such exposure there was in these different countries. We can look at the degree to which these, I don't have as fancy a set of slides as Andreas, I'm sorry about that, with things moving in and out in color, but you'll have to simply put up with my rather simple slides. We divided the countries into the four quadrants. The upper right quadrant would be the one where they had a lot of exposure to both applied mathematics and formal mathematics. This is self-reported by the students since there's no teacher connected to these students. And what you have in that top quadrant, you find the United States, for example. High on applied math, which is the horizontal axis, you will find the Netherlands. And if any of you know very much about mathematics education, the Netherlands has been one of the leaders in pushing toward applied mathematics. And so one finds them in that quadrant, but not as much formal math. You find the typical Asian countries that perform very well in that left upper quadrant, where you have a lot of formal mathematics, but not that much applied mathematics. We then fitted a three-level model to the data, and we found statistically significant relationships at all three levels: country, schools, and within schools. We found the relationships that suggested there was a positive linear relationship of formal math to performance at all three levels, and we found a positive, much smaller effect associated with the word problems, the exposure to word problems at all three levels. What we found, though, with applied mathematics was a different kind of a relationship. It was a quadratic relationship as represented here, where the countries that had the largest exposure, which is again the horizontal axis, where those are doing the worst, because the vertical axis is performance. And you can see this sort of negative quadratic relationship suggesting that those that did the most of applied mathematics were the countries that performed the poorest on the test. Now, what was more interesting to us is to go within the countries. So we fitted a two-level model, school and then within school, a model to each of the countries, and looked at that relationship. And I think that relationship is a more interesting one. You can see from this slide, these are the countries. We actually worked on most of these slides with the OECD countries plus 8 other major economies. We call them the OECD plus. And you see those, and for each of the columns it indicates both at the student and the school level whether things were significant or not. I draw your attention to two things. The third column and the sixth column is formal math. You see it's virtually significant in a linear fashion in almost all countries. The second and the fifth show the nature of the relationship of the applied math, and in most cases it's quadratic, but it's not as prevalent as the formal mathematics. Here's a sort of summarizes the linear significant relationship between formal mathematics and performance on PISA. The darker bar is the OECD average, which is about a half a standard deviation. And what you see is if the United States is above that, in the United States the effect is essentially about 0.75 standard deviation. And in fact, if you go up to Singapore at the top, it's about 0.85 of a standard deviation, the relationship of the formal math to performance on PISA. Word problems had a smaller effect, and I'm not going to dwell on that. This display shows you the countries that fit into the 4 categories of significance or not significance with respect to the applied mathematics. And you can see that the United States is in a category where it was not significant at either level. You look in the significant at both levels, you see countries like England, the United Kingdom, you see Canada, and other countries, Finland, in that particular category. So this relationship varied with applied mathematics across the different countries. Andreas showed you this slide, the blue line, the bottom one, which is the OECD average, but I thought it'd be interesting for you to see a few of the other countries. The green one, which has the big dip, that's the Netherlands. What these slides show is that you would basically have improvements, and if you take the OECD average, you actually get about a 40-point predicted difference up to the point as you move from, say, never to rarely in the amount of application and exposure you have to applied mathematics. Around that point is when the thing it reaches its high point and then begins to drop. And in some cases, that drop is another 10 points. And you can see in the Netherlands the substantial drop-off as you go past a certain point. This, I think, is an important result in the United States, where some advocate that most mathematics, if not all mathematics, should be taught in an applied context. It raises the specter that that may not be the best approach, that one tends to find across these countries a dip point at which the greater exposure, probably because it's a trade-off issue with the formal math, begins to produce a more negative impact. The PISA has many different tests, and you can see here where, at the country level, the different relationships where. What I would suggest that's interesting to look at here in particular is employ, formulate, and interpret. Those are the three things I mentioned to you before. Notice that for formulation, which is moving from the problem, the real-world problem, to a mathematical representation, or interpreting, which is moving back, the formal math was not statistically significant. You would expect it wouldn't necessarily, but still the applied mathematics, greater exposure to that, was statistically significantly related to these two aspects of literacy. And I think that result. The other one that's quite interesting, Andreas mentioned the computer problem-solving test, which is not about mathematics. And so I just did this analysis. Well, guess what? Formal math is not related, but applied math is. So that the exposure to application problems may well impact problem-solving in a more generic sense. That's just my general hypothesis. Certainly it needs much more exploration. This just shows you, I can summarize it simply, that essentially if you look at the relationships and asking how many of the countries did you find these relationships, for word problems it was 77%, for applied math it was 69% of all the countries had that significant relationship. For formal math it was 98% of the countries showed that relationship. The last thing that I wanted to share with you is another aspect of this. What I've shown you so far simply shows that, in fact, much like what we found in the TIMS studies, is that there is a relationship between schooling, defined as the opportunity that students have, the exposure they have to the mathematics courses and what's in those courses. And you can see that much like the TIMS, formal mathematics, that is school math, becomes a strong, powerful has a strong, powerful relationship to performance on PISA as it did in TIMS. So in that sense, those share that. But what we see here is that there is this applied mathematics having a much lesser impact. But when even controlling for that formal mathematics exposure, you actually see an impact, but it's a more complicated sort of relationship, being quadratic in nature. But the second thing that the second major point I want to make to you is, so what about this issue, and Andreas raised this issue strongly, about equity, about the inequalities within the countries. What we did is we took the OECD indicator of social class, but we looked at it within a country and looked at the within-country distribution so as to take the differences across countries out of this. And we looked and divided the schools within that country according to its own distribution into three sets. The two that we'll focus on here are those that are advantage schools, that is, those schools with the highest social class associated with that school, and those schools with the lowest social class. And we then looked at the difference. So that defines a social class difference, which gets into what both of them have spoken about previously. That measure was just based on social class. We then looked at the difference between within a country and then averaged across countries. We looked at the difference in performance between the advantaged schools and the disadvantaged schools. Not surprisingly, we found a huge difference, about 1 standard deviation difference across the average across the OECD countries. We then also looked at the gap, the difference, call it the curriculum gap, that existed across those schools. And we similarly found a large difference in opportunity between the advantaged schools and the disadvantaged schools. And this display shows you across countries how big that opportunity gap was. The longer the bar, the bigger the gaps. So you can see, if you look at this, you probably can't see it very easily, but I can tell you those countries with the largest opportunity gap between advantaged and disadvantaged schools included countries like France, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, and Brazil. Those countries that had the smallest gap between their schools in terms of opportunity were Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Russia, and Poland. So you see some patterns that we've heard about before, that there are such differences. By the way, Chinese Macau was the only one of all of these economies that actually had no difference, really a zero difference in opportunity between the advantaged and disadvantaged schools. So finally, I show you this, which is the relationship, a regression analysis across the countries using the country averages between, excuse me, looking at on the horizontal axis, the difference in opportunity, and the vertical axis, the difference in the performance between the advantaged and disadvantaged schools. And you can see a strong statistical relationship between those two. In fact, this simple model of just the gap in opportunity related to the gap in performance accounted for 49% of the variance, with no other accounting of any other country characteristics. And quite interestingly, if you take a 1-unit difference in opportunity on the scale we devised, it predicted over 1 standard deviation difference in performance between the advantaged and disadvantaged schools. And my final point to you is this. I think this begins to open the door, although clearly in need of much further analysis, which is done in a white paper that's on the PISA site, is that it appears that social class has not only its own direct impact through issues of capital, the capital, but also it has an indirect effect. That is through the schooling that children receive. So social class impact has a double impact. The total effect is the sum of the two. And so you get a direct impact, which comes from the family, but you also get an indirect impact, as you can see here, through the social class as it interacts and produces differences in opportunity. So thank you very much.
Well, great. So I can even start off the questioning before I leave. And go ahead. You know what I'm going to do to get the maximum number of questions possible? I'm going to take questions in groups of 3. How's that? Okay. Maybe 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay. You're the next 3.
Okay. Hi. My name is Heinz Siedermeyer. Andreas and I share the accent, as you can tell. I did a book on PISA power policy where we came to much of the same conclusions that Martin Carnoy was pointing out, for example, about the difficulty with PISA data to separate educational from non-educational effects, for example, cultural effects. I also wrote a commentary in Teachers College Record on PISA as a tale of flaws and hubris, where I'm pointing out that you get the big differences, the headline-grabbing differences, only because you have a half a dozen countries which are culturally and socially speaking Disneyland countries, small homogeneous nation states, often authoritarian, which are very hard to compare to a large heterogeneous country like the US. But my main point in 30 seconds, the discourse is quite strongly dominated by economic thinking. If we take a political lens to PISA and OECD, we find that what has happened in the last 10 years is that the power center in education policy making and thinking has shifted from the nation state to a global level, where we have OECD, the World Bank, McKinsey, Pearson, creating a center of gravity that is extremely powerful. That I'm sorry. The question is, what do we do about the accountability gap that has emerged between the democratically controlled nation states and the non-democratically controllable new governance structure that OECD represents? You make policy, but you cannot be, accounted for. Nobody can vote you out, Andreas, and vote Martin Carnoy in the PISA.
Yeah.
I think they're recording just a speech.
Sigrid Blömecke from Humboldt Universität, Berlin in Germany. Thank you very much for these intellectually stimulating talks. And although at a first glance it looked as if Martin and Bill disagree on a lot of aspects, I think a crucial overlap was that both of you stressed the importance of teacher distribution, because Martin argued if you control for the differences in teacher distribution across schools according to socioeconomic background, the effect of schooling on achievement would substantially decrease. And actually Bill somewhat made the same point. So my question is, to what extent, because I don't think it's an either or. So Martin tried to make a point that it's societal issues. Bill tried to make a point it's opportunities to learn. It's probably both. The question is, do we have any idea to what extent the opportunities to learn effect would decrease, Bill, if we control for the three characteristics Martin mentioned: educational aspirations, neighborhood or composition effect, and teacher quality or teacher distribution. If we control for these three characteristics, do opportunities to learn then still matter?
Well, the short answer is that in Russia they do, but it really decreases the coefficients.
So there is much more agreement between the two of you at the
But in other countries it may not. I mean, do you have to do the study country by country?
I was going to add that.
Maybe we just let the questions first.
Oh, are all the questions first, or do we respond?
I'm going to leave. That's why I had to say.
Oh, okay.
My question is short. I'm looking at the differences among the states in the United States and wondering to what extent social services come into play when you're talking about achievement differences.
Go ahead.
No answer? Thank you. So I think the discussion of those variables in schools are very important, but I felt that there was a bit of a cavalier set of conclusions that were based on one test. And anyone who works in schools will know that students who are not engaged or who are alienated don't necessarily care about our questions. So my concern is that it seems to me reckless to collapse the whole conception of social background into a simple idea about poverty. And I really appreciated the warning that Dr. Kornoy gave about plopping our conclusions about these things on very simple linear connections. And I just wanted to say that as someone who's been a principal for 12 years and I'm now moving over to a position in a school of education, I'm so concerned about the way that we're being driven in schools by a hypervigilance that has been coming from the conclusions that we're making based on the PISA to governmental non-educators who are then doing some very reckless policy entrepreneurship that's ruining our schools almost to the point of if we had a totalitarian government put in place, only perhaps more because it's happening right in our local schools. So I want to thank this panel for the wide range of views here and just say that I'm very worried about the future of America when we make, in American schools, when we make such simple and shallow conclusions, and do hope that you'll have some more social science input into the statistical analysis of these findings based on the PISA. Thank you.
I'm going to turn this over to Bill now. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found the session interesting.
Yeah, just a couple of points first on this issue of accountability. In fact, the one thing I can assure you of is that the OECD has neither financial nor legislative powers of any kind to influence governments. What we do is we provide them with comparative evidence, and it's up to each country, each education system to use or ignore it. And actually what we hope, of course, is that countries do make intelligent use out of it, and many do. I mean, my own country is a very good example that took those results very serious and has made very serious progress in closing socioeconomic gaps and raising overall achievement. But that's really up for every, I mean, this is like all research, you know, you can use or ignore research of any kind. But the main point I wanted to make is that I'm not sure we should make that sort of very strict distinction between school and society. In fact, you know, I think Martin Kano and myself, we put actually this social expectation on education right on top. The question, I think, that where we are separated is, and you can call it a cultural component. The question that probably separates us is culture inherited, it's the context, we can't do anything about it, or is it created by what we actually do? And if you actually study why do certain countries put so much value on education, you can actually learn a lot from that. Actually, one anecdotal experience, I was recently in one of the poorest areas of China, where education, where the children in school had no cultural capital of any form. This was the first generation of children in school. And it was actually the school and the social institution that created that value and that expectations, that gave those children a sense, if you succeed here, you're going to be successful in life. And in one way, I wouldn't sort of say, well, this is the strict rule. The role of teachers is just teaching. Most high-performing education systems have a lot, and you saw that in the data, have a lot of time for teachers to do other things than teaching. In that school in China, every teacher would call every parent twice per week, and that was built in their working time. And that's actually, public policy can do a lot to actually shape that kind of social context. I want to come to this point that both Bill made and Martin made. The way you distribute teachers influences the way in which opportunities are distributed, and that amplifies the impact which social background has. So you can say, well, schools can't do anything about it. Well, I would argue the opposite. I think public policy can do a lot about it by actually attracting talented teachers in disadvantaged schools. And surprise, surprise, that's what many high-performing countries actually do. They build teacher careers, the careers of school principals, precisely around that. Again, Shanghai is a great example for that. If you're a vice principal in a high-performing school and you want to become a principal, the only way to get there is actually to take on a tough school and actually show that you can improve it. That's why you make it actually a matter of status to get talent in a disadvantage. And it works, and it reshapes the opportunity, and that actually changes the way in which social background operates. So in a way, I think we have a lot more policy levers than narrowly taking school as sort of just about teaching in the classroom.
Yeah, I would add to that point is that clearly when you look at that one slide I showed, which was the gap in between the advantage and disadvantage and opportunity, all those nations that you saw in there have poverty, they have poor people, they have rich people, yet look at the difference in those gaps. Some of those countries it was huge, in other countries it was almost non-existent. So that is being impacted probably by public policy and not just the whims or the randomness of the event, because all these countries undoubtedly have disadvantaged and advantaged schools. And remember, those definitions were within country. So they're not by some universal standard of what's advantage and disadvantage, which would make no sense, but it's a within country thing. I wanted to respond to the teacher thing, and Andreas touched on this. Teachers' knowledge is obviously central and critical. There's a TED study that shows that, their preparation, how much a difference that makes. But then also this opportunity. Those two things are so intertwined. So when you start controlling for one, because the opportunity is delivered by the teachers, and their knowledge impacts on what they deliver. So it's very hard to disentangle those two things. And I think they all come down in many ways because the teacher, delivers the opportunities that the curriculum calls for. So I think that we're not far apart in that issue. You're absolutely right. And finally, I would say to the last questioner if you think about the powerful impact that all three of us talked about that schooling makes, whether it's the opportunity I was talking about or some of the other characteristics Andreas was talking about, is essentially we now know fairly convincingly from both of these international studies that opportunity does make a difference to what children learn. It's also logical. If kids aren't taught calculus, they're not going to somehow invent it in their own heads. So this is not revolutionary, it's sensible, but it's a quantitative indication of relationship. So that's hardly designed to hurt schools. It's trying to say that what schools do and what teachers do is really important.
Just sort of one more question. I mean, Martin concluded with, what is the relationship between PISA scores and productivity? Of course, PISA scores or skills are not sufficient for enhanced productivity, but they're necessary. And in fact, we have tested that with our adult survey of skills. It's really interesting results. I give you two extremes. You take Japan, on this survey, had the highest distribution of skills in the population, workforce population. And the United States, pretty patchy, no? Long tail, not very great overall. When you look at the way in which skills actually are utilized, you find the United States on top. The United States was number one in actually extracting value from skills, converting skills into better jobs, better lives. In Japan, skill utilization was very, very poor. No? The labor market is very sectorial, very segmented, very hierarchical. Women are excluded from many occupations. Lots of things going on there. And both of those factors, the skills you have and how you use them, shape productivity. But the Japanese problem is much easier to fix than the American one. No? You can actually if you actually fix your labor market, your institutions, you can actually raise productivity dramatically. If the issue is the pipeline of skills, that's a lot harder to fix. And actually, when you take those things into account, the link between skills and productivity is very, very strong.
I forgot what Martin said, so anybody want to ask a question, not the segmenting, because I can't figure it out. Go ahead. You need to go up there, please.
The conversation's all about teachers and what they're teaching, but teachers can only teach the curriculum they're given, and we haven't talked so much about the role the curriculum plays, that articulated taught curriculum. In some countries, compulsory education ends at 16. For the U.S., it doesn't end until really 2 more years later. So we may have backloaded things, like when algebra is taught versus others. Can you give us some sense of how decisions about the taught curriculum have impacted the study?
Maybe we just collect some questions.
I would just simply ask you to provide the slides to us for all 3 presentations. I don't know how you're going to do that, but I hope you will do it soon.
Can't do it for Martin, but I'm willing to share the slides I have as well.
Thank you to you both, and especially with respect to your last comment, Andreas, and you had a lot of amazing graphs. I wondered, in terms of the link between PISA and future productivity and performance, do you have any graphs that relate outcomes in PISA to the number of Nobel Prizes or patents released from a country? And in terms of income spent on education in countries, especially the East Asian countries, I'm wondering if you have any graphs that show the amount of personal income spent on tutorial schools, because that's a billion-dollar industry. Thank you.
You can have that one.
Yeah.
Yes. Just a couple of things that I also think, because I really enjoyed your presentation. One was about high-stakes testing and the effect of that, because teachers often say the best way to make sure that my kids will do well on their test is to only teach in a school where they did very well last year, right? Which tends to make experienced teachers go to high-achieving schools, sort of a reverse triage. And the other thing is, in America, we're often all sticks and no carrots. I'm first-generation college from a very poor family in a rural area, but even though I didn't do well in high school, because I didn't go often, and when I went, they asked me to leave, I automatically was admitted to any college, and my Pell Grants covered everything. And when my undergraduates hear that now, they're kind of, they can't believe that. So also that, are the other countries that tend to do better, is there an opportunity, if you're high achieving, that you get to go to college? Versus even if you're high achieving, if you don't have the money, you can't go, so why bother?
Okay.
What order do you want to do it in?
Pardon?
Shall I do it on first and
Let's do the first one, yeah.
the taught? I'm not quite sure exactly what you're asking, because what we were talking about is the taught curriculum, the slides that I showed, which showed the relationship to performance. That was actually from the kids' perspective what they were taught in school, and it was found to be related.
Applied or not, but that's different from whether or not they're taught algebra at 8th grade, 7th grade, or later, because word problems can be on.
Right. Well, this is the PISA is a cumulative test of knowledge, and this is a cumulative measure of opportunity up to that point. So you're right. I mean, if the structure is entirely different. But I can tell you from another study that I was involved in TIMS, if you look across all these countries, actually at that 15-year-old point, it is essentially algebra that virtually every kid in every country is being exposed to. That's almost a given at that particular age. So I don't think your worry is really warranted in this particular case. No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. No, we have restricted ourselves to things that exposure would have been high. Actually, every test item that is used in PISA is validated for curricular relevance in every country. So there's a study basically asking countries to what extent students would be typically exposed. The sequencing still is an issue. The sequencing of curricula is very different across countries. And some curricula are very strongly sequenced, like the Japanese, where everything builds carefully on everything else. And some is like the United States, where you learn the same thing many times in school. So
not anymore.
Right, but I mean, sort of there are big differences across. I wanted to comment on the other things. What do we know about the impact of PISA performance on the lives of adults? We have two ways to study this. One is actually 5 countries so far have actually done longitudinal follow-up studies, and it's really, really interesting. The Canadians started that first in the year 2000. The Australians followed 2003, Switzerland, Uruguay, actually, and so there you can actually study to what extent test performance on PISA influences, access to higher education, employment, and those kinds of things, earnings. And it's actually interesting. You can go even deeper. You can actually look at the type of task that was asked in PISA and its relative impact on sort of future trajectories. That's one way. There's another way, and for that our adult skills survey is the better source when you think about aggregate productivity and economic outcomes, innovation, and so on. Now you can look at the skill distribution in the adult population and look at those economic and social outcomes. And the relationships are amazingly strong. I mean, skills are, the type of PISA skills are very strong predictor, not just for earnings and employment, but for many social and civic outcomes as well. How do we measure innovation as well? Innovation is a great example where you can actually see that skills are a strong predictor for this. And it's conceptual understanding in mathematics turns out actually to be the most predictive part on those kinds of things. Volume of investment, that was a very good question. It's hard to sort of quantify. We can actually quantify the financial investment that is made in education, either by governments or by families, and either in school or in the form of private tutoring. We have actually very good data now on the volume of learning in different forms, and reasonable data on the financing of that as well. College access, that question is very different across countries. You go to the Nordic countries, college admission rate in the United States is about average. It used to be number 1 in the OECD area, but 10 years ago, but today most countries are at a very similar level, and you have a fair number of countries where you have now every second school graduate going on to college. Financial barriers vary a lot across countries. In some countries it's free, and others, you have to pay, and in yet other countries you pay, but you get a loan from the country. So, and we haven't been able to study any kind of direct impact on that. The issue of high-stakes testing, we could actually not see in the PISA test, not see any, at the system level, not see any relationship between the prevalence of high-stakes testing and the performance of education systems. We could actually see a slightly positive relationship on equity. Countries where students had greater exposure to testing turn out to be countries where the impact of social background was a bit less. We haven't sort of given those results a lot of prominence in the reports because the effects were very, very small compared to the effects that you've seen on the slides here. And I think that brings us to the end.
Actually, we still have about 5 minutes if anybody has a burning question. If not, we would be done. Any other questions?
Hi, West Coast Canadian Leadership Studies. I was thinking about what the principal said, and we've always found the OECD and PISA and TIMS things very helpful in British Columbia because we are decentralized, so we can look across our country. And so my question is about, I'm going to give an example and then say, is there something that we could do as an AERA community or an OECD community to do something about this? In our country, Quebec actually does quite well mathematically, and the rest of us are medium. In probing what Quebec does, they actually have people starting from grade 4 teaching math who like it. And when we found that out in British Columbia, at the school level, we made that change immediately, because that's not, whether that's low-hanging fruit or a quick win. So I just wonder whether there's any easy place to find, or if there could be an easy place to find, those sort of intelligent responses to what somebody else is doing that we could learn from. Lesson design, having people knowledgeable in math teach it earlier, a little bit earlier, those kinds of things. Is there an inventory of those things? Could there be? Where would we find it?
Yeah, it's a good question. In fact, the PISA website is an increasingly valuable resource in this respect, where you find actually a lot of national and local studies on this. We also have a new project. It's called PISA for Schools, actually, where individual schools can voluntarily now take the PISA test, and there's a lot of really good experiences coming out of this. Schools, because you get a much data that is much closer to your local context. And you can compare yourself to statistical neighbors, schools that are similar in whatever variables are important to you. Look at to what extent performance varies, and then actually get in contact with those schools. There's a lot of sharing at that level happening. But if you look to the national sites on the PISA website, there's really, I think, a lot of information that goes well beyond the kind of comparative context.
Okay.
And if you have specific questions on that, drop me an email. I'll be happy to direct you to that.
Okay, one more question.
Well, I actually quite suspicious of the value of PISA test. And it looks that we only look at the measurable skills, but there are many non-measurable skills. They would argue that at least for the measurable skills, the higher the better. But it could be possible there would be some kind of negative correlation between measurable skills and non-measurable skills. So could it be that the higher the measurable skills, the worse? So this is one of my arguments. Another second thing is that people consistently say that, the higher the measurable skills, the higher their productivity is. Where you do this measurement only in one society, only in one system, it could be possible that the measurable skills just reflect their relative level of intelligence. So if in one society, all the people get higher the measurable skills, maybe their productivity remains the same. The difference is just their relative levels. So if you look at the scores in Japan, very high, the scores in the United States, relatively low, then you think that if you raise the scores in the United States, then the productivity would be higher. Then I would suspect that it's not true, because this kind of measurable skills only show their relative intelligence. So you raise the measurable skill in the United States, you won't change their IQ distribution. So that's my question.
Well, I mean, your hypothesis seems to be that Japanese are more intelligent than Americans. I'm not sure that this is something you can deduce from this. Actually, historical growth regressions are a very interesting way to look into this. And in fact, what you can see is that countries that have actually seen huge increases in test scores over time have also seen huge increases in productivity. In fact, Asia is a great example for this. If you look at countries like Singapore or Korea with very low levels of traditional levels of skills, and actually as skill levels increased, productivity of the economy has increased. So I actually think there is a lot of value in a lot of evidence at the micro and at the macro level looking at productivity. And of course, PISA measures only certain dimensions of skills. I think that we have to be very clear about it. It's about largely cognitive skills. And there are other skill dimensions, social-emotional skills, that are also important. But, the absence of mathematics skills doesn't imply the presence of those kinds of social emotional skills. And in fact, when you look at this carefully, there is a lot of research on this. Those things all tend to be highly intercorrelated. I think actually, I give you an example. In July, we're going to release a new survey on where we tested financial literacy, another kind of skill domain. And there will be lots of people who say, well, the more financial literacy you teach, the higher you will score on the financial literacy test. No? We find no relationship between the exposure to financial literacy teaching and financial literacy scoring. We do, however, find a very strong relationship between the PISA measure of exposure to conceptual understanding in mathematics and financial literacy, telling me, you teach students mathematics well, they understand the fundamental paradigms, they know what risks, the probability is, and they will be able to extrapolate financial literacy. As opposed to you have this curriculum that covers everything, every possible skill dimension at very little depth. It doesn't, I think we should not treat those things as one taking away from the other. We should look at this as a basket of skills of which you need a combination. And as time goes on, PISA is going to be better and better at those things. In 2015, for the first time, we're going to measure interpersonal skills. In 2018, we'll be looking at what we call global competences. There's an effort actually to progressively widen the range of skills that we assess, and over time we'll be able to assess your hypothesis. So far, we see no evidence that actually, teaching mathematics means we're doing less on other important things.
And I would just add as a closing comment that, in fact, when you look across this new result, which I did not yet know, but if you think about the results from the Tim study, the ones I just presented, the stuff he's been presenting, there's a pretty clear pattern that opportunity around basic mathematics is related to all of these dimensions. And it seems that that's what this study is showing. You can then evaluate what that level, be it computer-based testing. I showed you that one slide, that those results occurred through all of the subtests within it. So I think we know now that that really some decent formal schooling in mathematics is pretty much a prerequisite for dealing with and performing well on any of these. And then you can argue about the rest as to what that impacts productivity and other things. Thank you for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. Hey, Kate. I'm all right.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk to you.
Are you getting excited?
I am, yeah. I'm nervous.
What, from a new job? Now you go in confident.
All right.
That's what you need to do.
Okay.
So good.
Hi,
I'm so
Veronica.
proud. I'm so glad for you.
Thank you.
Because I know you were kind of anxious to figure out where you were going to go and what you were going to do next.
I
but-
was.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. I'm sorry about the timing.
It's all right.
Workshop. If it had been any other month.
Yeah, no, I understand actually now that I understand the rest of the history of it, but because I was wondering why you didn't respond.